Good morning, everyone. We have come together today on Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service to remember this remarkable man, to listen to his words through various voices, and reflect on those words and share what they mean to us today. We are aware for some here today, some of his words are as relevant today as they were in the 1960s when he spoke them. What today means to me is not only remembering him, but the many individuals who fought for injustices and inequalities before him, with him, and since his assassination, and what I could do to help not only move the discussion on relevant topics of injustices, but how I can become a more effective advocate on such issues. Today, we are very fortunate to be hearing from 6 of our colleagues who will share their favorite speech or excerpt of a speech of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We will have the opportunity to share reflections of each speech which was shared. Additionally, Ray Ward will conclude by sharing ways we can become an advocate. I would like to share 2 favorite quotes of mine of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The first, an individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. The second quote is, everyone can be great because anyone can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and verb agree to serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love. Before we hear from our first reader, I would like us all to join in singing together, Lift Every Voice and Sing. I think Ray Ward will lead and we'll join him.
Well, I'm actually going to defer the leadership to Kirk Franklin, so please join in as you're able.
Even better.
I'm going to cue this up. Can people hear this?
Every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise to the listening sky. Let it resound like the holy sea. Sing a song full of the faith of the darkness and struggles. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising of our new day begun. Let us march on to the reason.
We got the church version, so we skipped a couple of verses there. But I just want to note, I don't know if people have heard, there's a call to see if we could, as a nation, get behind this as a national hymn. We've got a national anthem, but is there a place for this song that comes out of a deep history of African American and Black working in this country for the betterment of the country, to make that a hymn that would be open to all? So I just thank you, Jose, for the chance to share that.
Thank you. So we will start with the first reading by Mary Lou, Letter from a Birmingham Jail.
Good morning. I found it difficult to isolate a small selection of any of the speeches. However, the following excerpt from Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which was written in August of 1963, struck a chord of justice versus injustice. You need to understand that in 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed. In 1877, Hayes was elected president. When he took office, he took troops away from the South, which left the South to their own devices. And unfortunately, they reverted back to times of segregation. So in 1929, when Dr. King was born, 50 years or so had passed, and all of this was bubbling up and brewing as Dr. King was growing. That led to this march and this letter, and he was incarcerated. My excerpt starts. You express a great deal of anxiety over the willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. It is rather strange and paradoxical to find us consciously breaking laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what's the difference between the two? How does one determine when a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. To use the words of Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, segregation substitutes an I-it relationship for the I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. So segregation is not only politically, economically, sociologically unsound, but is morally wrong and sinful. Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. Isn't segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, an expression of his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness? So I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court because it's morally right. And I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances because they are morally wrong. Let us turn to a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. This is the difference made legal. On the other hand, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow and that it is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. Let me give another explanation. An unjust law is a code inflicted upon a minority, which that minority had no part in enacting or creating because it did not have the unhampered right to vote. Who can say that the legislature of Alabama, which set up segregation laws, was democratically elected? Throughout the state of Alabama, all types of conniving methods are used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. And there are some counties without a single Negro registered to vote, despite the fact that Negroes constitute a majority of that population. Can any law set up in such a state be considered democratically structured? These are just a few examples of unjust and just laws. There are some instances when a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I was arrested Friday on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there's nothing wrong with an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade. But when the ordinance is used to preserve segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and peaceful protest, then it becomes unjust. Of course, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was seen sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar because a higher moral law was involved. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of the chopping blocks before submitting to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. We can never regret that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. But I am sure that if I had lived in Germany during that time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers, even though it was illegal. If I lived in a communist country today where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I believe I would openly advocate disobeying these anti-religious laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily.
Welcome.
Could you say another word about why you chose that for today?
Sure. I think recent events, I'd say the last 18 months or more, there's been this almost moral religious struggle where people sometimes hide behind the skirts of their religious beliefs, not understanding that the moral law that's in the Bible is about people, and that in the sight of God, we are all people. No one's better than anybody else. And we need to defend our fellow people. And so I think that I was living at the time that this was written. I was very young, but I was still living at that time. And I think it really took more than courage, the strength of character that Dr. King had. It amazes me today as an adult because I didn't understand it when I was a child. And even though we've come a long way since then, it's a drop in a larger pail of water that, like, we have so far to go.
Beautiful. All right. Thank you very much. Does anybody else have a response to this, a reflection that they'd like to share? I just wanted to chip in. Thank goodness for this, because every time I teach a class on ethics, I'll ask people, just because it's against the law doesn't mean it's wrong. And you know, if I had to go back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I don't think I'm going to get most of the class thinking about that. But if I can talk about MLK, people get it, they know it, and just thank God for that witness.
If we're not hearing from anyone else about that reflection, thank you, Mary Lou, again. Next, our next reader is Naya Brown, The Other America. Naya?
Hi, everyone. Hopefully, everyone's doing well. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just going to read an excerpt from The Other America, so please enjoy. But I like to use a subject from which to speak this afternoon, the other America. And I use this subject because there are literally two Americas. One America is beautiful for situation, and in a sense, this America is overflowing with the milk of prosperity and the honey of opportunity. This America is the habitat of millions of people who have food and material necessities for their bodies, and culture and education for their minds, and freedom and human dignity for their spirits. In this America, millions of people experience every day the opportunity of having life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness in all of their dimensions. And in this America, millions of young people grow up in the sunlight of opportunity. But tragically and unfortunately, there is another America. This other America has a daily ugliness about it that constantly transforms the ambivalency of hope into the fatigue of despair. In this America, millions of work starved men walk the streets daily in search for jobs that do not exist. In this America, millions of people find themselves living in rat infested, vermin filled slums. In this America, people are poor by the millions. They find themselves perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. In a sense, the greatest tragedy of this other America is what it does to little children. Little children in this other America are forced to grow up with clouds of inferiority forming every day in their little mental skies. As we look at this other America, we see it as the arena of blasted hopes and shattered dreams. Many people of various backgrounds live in this other America. Some are Mexican Americans, some are Puerto Ricans, some are Indians, and some happen to be from other groups. Millions of them are Appalachian whites, but probably the largest group in this other America, in proportion to its size, is the population, is the American Negro, I'm sorry. The American Negro finds himself living in a triple ghetto, a ghetto of race, a ghetto of poverty, a ghetto of human misery. So, what we are seeking to do in the civil rights movement is to deal with this problem. To deal with this problem of the two Americas, we are seeking to make America one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, let me say that the struggle for civil rights and the struggle to make these two Americas one America is more difficult today than it was 5 or 10 years ago. For a decade or about 12 years, we struggled all across the South in glorious struggles to get rid of the legal, overt segregation and all the humiliation that surrounded the system of segregation. In a sense, this was a struggle for decency. We could not go to a lunch counter in so many instances and get a hamburger or a cup of coffee. We could not make use of public accommodations. Public transportation was segregated, and often we had to sit in the back and within transportation. Transportation within cities, We often had to stand over the empty seats because sections were reserved for whites only. We did not have the right to vote in so many areas of the South, and the struggle was to deal with these problems. And certainly they were difficult problems. They were humiliating conditions. By the thousands, we protested these conditions. We made it clear that it was ultimately more honorable to accept jail cell experiences than to gain accept for segregation and humiliation. By the thousands, students and adults decided to sit at segregated lunch counters to protest conditions there. When they were sitting at those lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and seeking to take the whole nation back to those great walls of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Thank you.
That's awesome, Naya. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you mind sharing a little bit about why you chose that passage?
Yes, of course. So this speaks to me on a deep and personal level. As a woman of color, those words are relevant today as they were back in the 60s. And it's kind of heartbreaking and frustrating and sad that although we've moved small mountains, we still have a long way to go. And it just seems like the steps forward we take, it's kind of like we take steps back at the same time. And I don't think it's still grasping in people's minds. And there's just way more that we need to do. So on a personal level, it speaks to me um, at my core. Like it's something that is I'm reminded of every day because I constantly see things in the media, constantly worried about my safety, people that look like me, and we just have a lot more to do. And I just want us to finally get some type of progress that's going to be consistent and permanent.
Amen.
Thank you all. Hope you enjoyed.
Any other thoughts or reflections that anybody else would like to share?
Yeah, I'd like to share. Naya, thank you. That was really a powerful piece. I think it really, spoke to me and resonated with me. So as a Black man, I know the, what I took away from that piece and that reflection was, or how I look at it is, kind of equating it to Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem "We Wear the Mask." So as a Black man, particularly in student affairs, I have earlier in my career had to wear that mask and live in kind of these two different worlds, one being academic, one being, prone to switching up the way in which I present myself and,
Code switching.
code switching, right. And,
Mhm.
I've been doing this now for 9, 10 years. So when I started my first 2 years, I was young and everybody always said, "Oh my God, you look like a student." I'm like, well, I'm not. And so now, 10 years later, I'm a lot older. But in that, I, I don't know. I just really went back and forth in and out of those two worlds a lot. And so, once I got the opportunity to really grow into my confidence and coming into my Blackness and being authentic with that, with myself, it was just like an amazing aha moment. And I love to see students go through that aha moment when it's like, okay, you can be your authentic self. You can bring your authentic self to the table. You don't have to live in those two worlds unless you choose, because everybody has their own way in which they choose to present themselves. And there's no right or wrong, you know what I mean? Because it's up to the person. But for me, I've found that it's been a lot easier just to be my authentic self. What you see is what you get. I'm bringing it to the table. I'm from Philly. It just is what it is. Because there are a lot of us who do live in those two different worlds. And then at the end of the day, whether it be for a check, whether it be for a title, whether it be for a position, you have to ask yourself, as a Black person or person of color, can you look at yourself in the mirror? And if you can't, for me, that's a challenge. So if you can't look at yourself in the mirror, be whole with yourself. Would Dr. King be happy with that? I don't know. Maybe, maybe it is okay. Back then it was okay to live in those two worlds. Maybe we'll still be in those two worlds. I know I had a great conversation this morning with one of my colleagues who works in Maryland, and I was challenging her, and I don't mean to take up so much time, but you hit on so many points with that piece, Naya. But I was challenging her because I said, Tia, like, I hear you. We haven't made much progress in your mind, but we also have, because even in the midst of all of this mess, that's what I call it in the world right now, there has been a slice of heaven or two or three for Black people and minorities. And what that looks like for me is people have been given opportunities that they would have never been given. Whether companies and corporations and universities are doing this to be reactive or whether they're being genuine and authentic, the opportunities are still being given. And people who have not been given a chance to have seats at certain tables are now being given those opportunities. That has come out of it. White people are now speaking up and saying Black lives do matter. 3 years ago, I was at the casino in Atlantic City and I had my Black Lives Matter shirt on, and people looked at me like I was disgusting. Now it's like a common thing, and like more people are open to it. So I'm trying to like convince my friend, like, there has been some progress. So when we look at things and we reflect on this special day, like really think about like, dang, there has been some progress. There has been some opportunities created. Now, in 3 years, we'll see if these people who've been given these positions are still there. We'll see where we are when we're reevaluating. We're looking for the next election and moving forward, where things are, if we're still in these two different worlds. But great piece. Thank you for letting me reflect. I can talk for hours about these things, but I appreciate it, and I'm happy to be here today. So
Thank you. We're going to have to link up later because I was trying so hard not to interrupt you, but I'm pretty sure you saw me excited and wanting to respond, but I wanted to give you the floor. But I completely agree with you. That's why I chose the piece as a woman of color. I've had the code switch. I'm still fairly young, so hopefully in 10 years later, I'll have your type of confidence, but definitely I would like to link up later. But I couldn't agree more with everything that you said, and I'm still learning too. So thank you. I'm glad it resonated with you. So I will hit you up later.
thank you, my sister. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to also just read out, Celia put it in the chat in case people didn't see it. She says, thank you, Naya. What strikes me about this is that we continue to live in two Americas that continue to be divided, and that some people feel this duality is acceptable. I think just back in what we've been saying. I mean, in some ways, it feels like it's worse than it was. In some ways, it feels like it's better. So, Andres, Naya, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts, or should we go to next? I mean, I don't feel like a comment is not going to fit with things that are coming. So we could. All right. How about we move to the next one and we'll see.
Yeah. Our third reader today. You ready? Right. Great. Is Guillermo Lopes, A Time to Break Silence.
Good morning, afternoon, everybody. My name is G. I am the Director of Campus Ministry, and I chose A Time to Break Silence, a declaration against the Vietnam War. I'll go into a little bit more after. I just chose 3 small paragraphs. Dr. King read this in April 4th, 1967, in Riverside Church in New York City. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is the most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in times of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulties against all apathy of conformist thoughts within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world. Moreover, when the issues at hand seem as perplexing as they often do in the case of this dreadful conflict, we are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty, but we must move on. And some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak. And we must rejoice as well, For surely this is the first time in our nation's history that a significant number of its religious leaders have chosen to move beyond the prophesizing of smooth patriotism to the high grounds of a firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. Perhaps a new spirit is rising among us. If it is, let us trace its movements and pray that our own inner beings may be sensitive to its guidance, for we are deeply in need in a way beyond the darkness that seems so close around us. We still have a choice today: nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. We must move past indecision to action. We must find new ways to speak for peace in Vietnam and justice throughout the developing world, a world that borders on our doors. If we do not act, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight. So I chose these three paragraphs for a couple of reasons. Um, One, I'm sure we've all possibly found ourselves in situations where politics is just not common talk. We always have one where you have to just really tread carefully around, especially around the holidays. I have a family member who is just just their thoughts, sometimes you get consumed by them and you just want to scream, you want to yell. And at times you might feel like that urge to just, let them have one. The other thing too, for on social media, I find that there's no civil discourse anymore. It's just commenting because I want to comment. There's no dialogue, there's no discourse. The last one, as somebody who works in the religious field, I find that people often ask anybody who works for the church or any Catholic organization, what is the moral thing to do? What is the right thing to do? Or how do we act? As if my decision or if my comment will impact the Catholic Church, as its whole. And sometimes I find frustration with my church leaders, with the bishops, with our pastors or vicars. Why is there more silence? Why is there not an opportunity for us to have these wholesome conversations? And lastly, with last week's events, with the storming of the Capitol, I think whenever it's time, Dr. Martin's the title was so attractive to me. It's time to break silence, and I find that when it was time to do something, it was almost like if anybody can remember the game of dodgeball, where everybody's in the back, and then the referee says go, and people just storm and just start throwing things at each other, and there's no rules. There's just here we go. And I find that type of way in the political world in the last couple of years has really made America into almost like this unknown. I'm from Brazil, and when we saw, my family, they mentioned that's stuff that we see in our world, in our country, people storming up the Capitol, blowing things up, and doing things because there's no civility. So Dr. King's words were very loud to me. I find that now is our time to break our silence in a peaceful way, to reintroduce conversation and civility back into our actions, because it seems like we've been missing the mark, especially when it comes to our conversational piece. Thank you.
Thanks, G. Thanks very much. I'm going to read out what Todd wrote in the chat. G, such important words for us to reflect upon, especially salient, as you pointed out, salient today, as you pointed out. Thank you. Any other thoughts anybody wants to share in response to that?
I like to respond. I just think it's kind of, you can really see the difference. So when Black Lives Matter, their protest was happening in the summer in Washington, I feel like there was a different response. But when Trump supporters stormed the Capitol, it was like, how should I say this? You could see the difference in the treatment. And if there were a different group of people doing that, it would have ended differently. And I think that's, in 2021, to see that difference so clearly and loudly, I just don't, it just still baffles me how that's still possible. So I think I think the biggest thing is really getting to the root cause of the problems that we're having. And I think sometimes it's been so surface level, and until we get to the core, like, I don't see the progress that we really need to break through. So it's just sad to see the difference so clearly that um, I've known as a person of color, but to actually see it in real life play out, it's kind of it's hard to see that. It's very hard, just mentally, spiritually, emotionally. So yeah, like I said, we still have a lot of work to do.
I agree. I think it's a beautiful reflection. I often, again, to bring in the spiritual component, when I saw every year I've been going to the March for Life to protest for Roe v. Wade, and to really get people to understand that life is precious. Life is just, it's more than, the babies, the innocent lives. It's those anywhere from those who are thinking of abortion to all those who are awaiting the death penalty. What I struggle with is, obviously, the current president is very strong with, he is the most pro-life president that we've ever seen. And I find that, that has been some challenging moments for me, because then who are we to play God to decide whose lives really matter more? And I think we really saw those in these moments, in these protests. We really decide whose lives are worth a little bit more, because we can push the limit with certain, we've seen that again with the Black Lives Matter, those who are struggling with their immigration status, and then so on and so forth. So again, I find that Dr. King, going into his comforts as a reverent speaker and just really challenging leaders, I think it's time to bring civility. I also really, again, just one more, just to get off my high horse, I really would like to challenge the bishops to really say something. I find that they're so passive, they're so afraid to get it wrong, they're so afraid for people to leave the church. I I think if I don't know, I just find it really frustrating when you're not going to stand up for the people who are really suffering, who are on the fringes, who are on the margins, and because you're worried about politics, donations. And I get it, those things are all important, but not at the extent of another life, so my thoughts.
Also, silence is deafening, and it's very, silence speaks volumes. So being silent about things is not, to me, it's just, it, whether you do or you don't, like verbal, nonverbals, they're all very important. So you staying silent, you gotta, at the end of the day, not to be morbid, but we all have our expiration, and at the end of the day, is it really gonna matter? Are those things really gonna matter? We should be here to connect as human beings, and the sooner we start realizing that we all have to coexist on this planet together, the better off we'll be, just accepting people for who they are. It's 2021 now. It's kind of getting old, and it's just, we just have to start really doing deep self-reflections and understanding that at the end of your life, are you really, is this really going to matter? Like, do you want to be judged based off of the things you have or the type of person you were? And I think just morally, we just need to kind of look deeper into that. That's just my perspective. Obviously, everyone has their own perspectives, but at the end of the day, like, this doesn't matter. All that matters is how we treated each other, to me. And it's just, I just feel like we have to do such a better job. But thank you again for your excerpt, and I love to hear your thoughts. So thank you so much for sharing.
Excellent, beautiful. I think we'll keep rolling on that then. We've got the next one coming up.
And we are fortunate to have our next reader, who is Todd Matthews, who is going to be reading from Drum Major Instinct. Todd.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose. Thank you, everyone. So the Drum Major Instinct is one of the final sermons Dr. King delivered before his assassination in 1968. It was one of the last ones he delivered, actually, at Ebenezer Baptist Church in early February of 1968. And he starts out by quoting from St. Mark chapter 10, verse 35. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came unto him, saying, Master, we would that thou should do us for whatsoever we shall desire. And he said unto them, What would ye that I should do for you? And they said unto him, Grant unto us that we may sit, one on thy right hand, and the other on thy left hand, in thy glory. But Jesus said unto them, Ye know not what ye ask. Can ye drink of the cup that I drink of, and be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? And they said unto him, We can. And Jesus said unto them, Ye shall indeed drink of the cup that I drink of, and with the baptism that I am baptized, withal shall ye be baptized. But to sit on my right hand and on my left hand is not mine to give, but it shall be given to them for whom it is prepared. And then Jesus goes on toward the end of the passage to say, But so shall it not be among you, but whosoever will be great among you shall be your servant, and whosoever of you will be the chiefest shall be servant of all. Dr. King goes on to say, the setting is clear. James and John are making a specific request to the master. They dreamed, as most of the Hebrews dreamed, of a coming king of Israel who would set Jerusalem free and establish his kingdom on Mount Zion, and in righteousness rule the world. And they thought of Jesus as this kind of king. And they were thinking of that day when Jesus would reign supreme as this new king of Israel. And they were saying, now when you establish your kingdom, let one of us sit on the right hand and the other on the left hand of your throne. He goes on to say, now very quickly, we would automatically condemn James and John, and we would say they were selfish. Why would they make such a selfish request? But before we condemn them too quickly, let us look calmly and honestly at ourselves, and we will discover that we too have those same basic desires for recognition, for importance, that same desire for attention, that same desire to be first. Of course, the other disciples got mad with James and John, and you could understand why, but we must understand that we have some of the same James and John qualities. And there is deep down within all of us an instinct. It's kind of a drum major instinct, a desire to be out front, a desire to lead the parade, a desire to be first. And it's something that runs the whole gamut of life. And so before we condemn them, let us see that we all have the same drum major instinct. Dr. King goes on in the sermon to talk about how this drum major instinct affects us as individuals, how it affects us as members of groups, as members of society and nations, and certainly, of course, as it impacts the racial struggle. But then as he starts to conclude, he says, I want you to see why Jesus was really saying, what was the answer that Jesus gave these men? It's very interesting. One would have thought that Jesus would have condemned them. One would have thought that Jesus would have said, you're out of your place. You're selfish. Why would you raise such a question? But this isn't what Jesus did. He did something altogether different. He said in substance, oh, I see. You want to be first. You want to be great. You want to be important. You want to be significant. Well, you ought to be. If you're going to be my disciple, you must be. But he reordered priorities and he said, yes, don't give up this instinct. It's a good instinct if you use it right. It's a good instinct if you don't distort it and pervert it. Don't give it up. Keep feeling the need for being important. Keep feeling the need for being first. But I want you to be first in love. I want you to be first in moral excellence. I want you to be first in generosity. That's what I want you to do. He goes on to say, Jesus gave us a new norm of greatness. And then he talks about, and I think, this is certainly one of the things that impacted me when I first saw this speech. He goes on to talk about what he would want people to say about him at his funeral. And he says, I don't think of it in a morbid sense. And every now and then I ask myself, what is it that I'd once said? And I leave the word to you this morning. If any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. And if you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell them not to talk too long. And every now and then I wonder what I want them to say. Tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. That isn't important. Tell them not to mention I have 300 or 400 other awards. That's not important. Tell them not to mention where I went to school. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. And I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all of the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have any money to leave behind. I won't have the fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind, but I just want to leave a committed life behind. And that's all I want to say.
Thank you, Todd. Could you say a little bit about how you came upon that, or
Sure, absolutely. So there's two answers to why I selected this today. So one is, of course, the standard academic. It's speaking to servant leadership, which is, I think, at the core of what we what we talk about in the programs that I'm a part of, and I think indeed really in what we talk about at Cabrini when we talk about leadership development and we talk about social justice. So certainly that's one piece. But the real significance of it for me is I learned about this sermon a few years ago when I visited the National Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta, and I saw this speech towards the end of my time there, because again, obviously it was not long before his assassination, and there was a chronology in the events of his life that they were displaying, and seeing these words kind of really struck me and resonated with me at that moment, which was a moment of particular crisis in my life, personally and professionally in a lot of ways, and it forced me to step back, and I think it was really in a lot of ways really significant in terms of getting me to see the things that I was holding on to maybe were too prideful, and were about enforcing rules and doing things like that, not recognizing that maybe the rules themselves were unjust. I think we've already heard this, or if not unjust, at least that they were that there were people involved, and that we had to hear their stories, and that we had to support them, and that really kind of changed my approach to how I do what I do, or at least try to on a daily basis, in terms of working with people and working with students, and being understanding the journeys that we're all going through as we try to navigate this life, and trying not to fall back on authority or fall back on pride, but instead simply to try to be that drum major for justice. And again, it's a never-ending struggle, and I'm sure if Dr. King were with us today, he would, I think he would probably say the same, that it's an ongoing struggle for us to work in that manner, but it's certainly something that is for me an ideal to aspire towards.
Awesome, thank you. Any other thoughts, responses, reflections, vibes off of what Todd was reading?
Can I just say the last part that you said? I feel like I just said that about, not worrying about what you have, or, the materialistic things, just being a good person. So it's just very noble of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to want to have that lasting impression on what he did for others, and not his accolades and everything, because like I said earlier, at the end of the day, to me, I feel like those aren't the most important. It's like what you did for other people and the legacy that you want to leave behind when it's your time. So that struck a chord with me. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Absolutely, and as you were saying that before, I was like, wow, this is saying so beautifully what's coming, and but I knew Dr. King's words would resonate. But you're absolutely right. I certainly heard that in I think what you were saying earlier, and appreciate very much what you had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd.
Mm-hmm.
Todd, I wanted to chime in. I don't know, when you kept talking about this idea of like pride and like putting your pride aside, I wonder, just as you were saying that, how much of the disconnect between certain communities has to deal with pride, personal pride that has, I don't know, that we have pride that we maybe grew up on, in terms of what we're just connected to because of ideas that our parents taught us. How much of the breakdown between people who are different, I guess, and there's no forward movement on those experiences and conversations and actions because of pride. I don't know, it just stuck out with me. It just really did, because I said, wow, that's really interesting, to hear someone else say, even my own pride I had to put aside, because I realized within my role, there were certain things I had to uphold and enforce, and some of those weren't even just or equal or fair. But because of pride, in some instances, we stun our own growth. So I wonder, and I mean, this is a question just in general for anyone to chime in on. I don't know. What do you think about that thought around pride?
I mean, I certainly, I know you opened it up to everyone. I would just say really quickly, first, thank you. I think that absolutely. I think there's a lot of pride, and within that, there's also often, fear. And I don't, and at that sense, I don't even think it's fear of the other as much as it is fear in ourselves, but it gets projected outwards. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think also so much of what Dr. King was talking about here is that converse of pride, the humility, and the importance of that as kind of the aspirational side. But it's difficult. I mean, it really is, because, so much of our world, and I think especially, quote unquote, Western cultures of several hundred years have promoted so much competitiveness and acquisitiveness and in a never-ending way, right? So I think you're absolutely right. It's just it becomes a toxic still. But I'd love to hear what others. I see that there's comments. I'd love to hear what others have to say. Thank you, Andre.
Yeah, I can read out Celia saying, great thought. Does pride create distance between us? Does it keep us from communicating? Great question. I would just throw in that I love what Dr. King is doing here, that he's doing this like a keto move on pride, right? On that instinct, that drum major instinct. He's saying it's not bad in itself, it's just misdirected. And let's direct that in the right way. And I think pride so often is that the flip side of shame, right? That it manifests as compensating because of some shame that's felt. I love people that read. I've read an interpretation of Adam and Eve. The Adam and Eve story isn't that it was pride that caused people to strive more. It was because they were ashamed of who they were, that they couldn't accept who they were, that they reached out beyond their rightful place, their limits, their position in the universe. But I think there's pride in the beauty of who we are, if we can clearly see that, and help to show that to others. I think that's what he's saying there. We need the right light. I feel like I'm talking too much too, so
I'll chime in. I mean, for me,
yeah, right.
it's just been an incredible year in so many regards, in different ways. And for me, like it might be even worse than pride. Sometimes I think it's apathy, and I think it's just selfishness. I think for a lot of folks, at least in my world, friends I grew up with, the neighborhoods that I, grew up in, they just want to just do their own thing. Like there's this absence of people wanting to get engaged, that they would just rather not talk about politics. They would not rather talk about race. They don't want to hear about it. They just want to go about their own lives, and just, and why can't things be the way that they were? I grew up right outside West Philly. I didn't have any people of color in my neighborhood. The only time we saw people of color was when we went into Center City and we drove through West Philadelphia. Or hear my mom talk about stories where she grew up at 31st and Brandywine. When she was younger, when they first moved there, it was called Corktown because of all the Irish, and now it's called Mantua because of all the people of color or Black people. So for a lot of people, that was kind of that was the only time that they saw people of color. And then this past year, just with politics just becoming so completely toxic, I think we're kind of at a crucible moment in terms of where you have to stop people from sharing misinformation. You have to start, like Cindy Eichler, who's the swim coach here, you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. If someone's sharing misinformation, you got to call them out on it. And I remember 2 weeks ago, we were in class, an OD class, and one person in our cohort, he's a minister, and he just, he has just an unbelievable, like most ministers, just have an uncanny ability of just, he doesn't speak a lot, but when he talks, he just carries a lot, like a lot of weight. And he talked about Martin Luther King, after the University of Alabama admitted a person of color, a black student, a female black student, but then it was just basically riots, and all the bad and people came out on campus, and then the trustees asked that student to leave campus. um, and then like the next day, the papers were saying that there was peace again on quiet, and peace on campus. And he Martin Luther King basically said that was obnoxious peace. And that's what, like, it's and I'll just pull a couple of quotes if you don't mind. There is peace on the campus of the University of Alabama, yet things were quiet in Tuscaloosa. Yes, there was peace on campus, but it was peace at a great price. It was peace that had been purchased at the exorbitant price of an inept trustee board succumbing to the whims and caprices of a vicious mob. It was peace that had been purchased at the price of allowing mobocracy to reign supreme over democracy. It was peace that had been purchased at the price of capitulating to the forces of darkness. This is the type of peace that all men of goodwill hate. It is the type of peace that is obnoxious. It is the type of peace that stinks in the nostrils of the Almighty God. And just real quick, Martin Luther King, he was talking. It was part of his sermon, and he had a conversation with someone about the bus situation, Freedom Riders, and he discussed the peace being destroyed in the community and destroying of good race relations. And he said, but peace is not merely the absence of tension, but it's the presence of justice. And even if we don't have this tension, we still wouldn't have positive peace. It would be peace that boiled down to stagnant complicity, deadening passivity. And he went on to say, he's like, if peace means this, I don't want peace. If peace means accepting second-class citizenship, I don't want it. If peace means keeping my mouth shut in the midst of injustice and evil, I don't want it. If peace means being complacently adjusted to a deadening status quo, I don't want peace. So that David Franklin, who was in my class, I never knew about this. And I went back and I read it after that class. And I was just like, this sums up for a lot of people where a lot of people are right now. As tragic as the riots were in DC, it was helpful in a way because we saw the people for who they were. They weren't behind social media accounts. And we now know that there is a segment of this population, and probably a very good segment of population, who may not have been there in person, but agree with the people who were there at the Capitol. So again, it's just, one of my points is that I was overwhelmed with politics. I talked politics my whole life. And I just grew tired of it. And I stopped calling people out. I became one of these people who were just complacent with it. And, one of my resolutions is to just start calling people out, as uncomfortable as that may be. So like when somebody talks about pro-life issues, and I respect, but like pro-life to me also means cradle to grave. That you can't applaud this administration for appointing justices who are pro Roe versus Wade and not look at the capital punishment. That this administration has the largest amount of people who have been killed on death row, 13 individuals, and 6 of them have been basically rushed over the past 6 months. You got to start. You can't focus in on one thing. Like, we really just have to come to honest and look for those hard truths. So, sorry, I'll get off.
Thank you, Brian.
Can I just say thank you to Brian, because I just appreciate the fact that, your willingness to, speak out. And as a person of color living through that and explaining it kind of gets tiresome. So having someone explain it from a different perspective is super helpful, and that's so needed. So although it's very tiring and frustrating and overwhelming, like I appreciate that. I think that's the push that we need. So I just want to personally say thank you for continuing to, reach out to speak up on issues that are unjust.
I feel like we got a bonus reflection there. That was excellent.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. That was reader number 7. So
just real quick, I mean, for anyone who is interested, it was called "When Peace Becomes Obnoxious."
Oh.
So I mean, really look at it. I mean, they got notes from his sermon, so it's a really I didn't know about it until my cohort, till David brought that up, and I thought it was just really, really good.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you, Todd, and everyone else. We'll go to our next reader, Lisa Podolsky. She's going to be reading from Remaining Awake, through a Great Revolution.
Thank you, Jose. I think having this discussion, I think a lot of the same themes that people have brought up are going to come out in this speech. So I'm excited for that. For those who don't know me, my name's Lisa. I work in the SEAL office, and I'm also a faculty member. And I chose this speech, which Dr. King delivered at the National Cathedral in DC, which is my hometown, on March 31st, 1968, because like so many of these other speeches we've heard today, it still resonates. You can still relate to it. If he gave this speech now, probably no one would blink an eye. And so that's both scary, and you can see how much we have to work towards progress, but it also shows how visionary he was and how these themes resonate through time. And just on a personal note, it has my favorite quote at the end that I'll talk about. So Dr. King starts, "I would like to use as a subject from which to preach this morning, remaining awake through a great revolution. The text for the morning is found in the book of Revelation. There are 2 passages there that I would like to quote. In the 16th chapter of that book, 'Behold, I make all things new, former things are passed away.'" And so Dr. King discusses the Washington Irving story, Rip Van Winkle. And most of us know Winkle as the person who slept for 20 years. But there's another point Dr. King says that is almost completely overlooked, which is a sign. He says, "When Rip Van Winkle went up into that mountain, the sign had a picture of King George III of England. When he came down 20 years later, the sign had a picture of George Washington, the first president of the United States. When Rip Van Winkle looked up at the picture of George Washington, and looking at the picture, he was amazed. He was completely lost. He knew not who he was. And this reveals to us that the most striking thing about the story of Rip Van Winkle is not merely that Rip slept 20 years, but that he slept through a revolution. While he was peacefully snoring up in the mountain, a revolution was taking place that at points would change the course of history, and Rip knew nothing about it. He was asleep. Yes, he slept through a revolution. And one of the great liabilities of life is that all too many people find themselves living amid a great period of social change, and yet they fail to develop the new attitudes, the new mental responses that the new situation demands. They end up sleeping through a revolution." So, after hearing Brian, I'm like, yes, this is exactly it. Dr. King goes on to say that there's a triple revolution taking place. A technological revolution with the impact of automation and cybernation. Then there is a revolution in weaponry with the emergence of atomic and nuclear weapons of warfare. Then there is a human rights revolution with the freedom explosion that is taking place all over the world. Yes, we do live in a period where changes are taking place, and there is still the voice crying through the vista of time saying, "Behold, I make all things new, former things are passed away." Dr. King goes on to say, whenever anything new comes into history, it brings with it new challenges and new opportunities. He says, first, we are challenged to develop a world perspective. No individual can live alone. No nation can live alone, and anyone who feels that he can live alone is sleeping through a revolution. The world in which we live is geographically one. The challenge that we face today is to make it one in terms of brotherhood. Dr. King says, through our scientific and technological genius, we have made of this world a neighborhood, and yet we have not had the ethical commitment to make it a brotherhood. But somehow and in some way, we have got to do this. We must all learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools. We are tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the way God's universe is made. This is the way it's structured. He says, secondly, we are challenged to eradicate the last vestiges of racial injustice from our nation. I must say this morning that racial injustice is still the Black man's burden and the white man's shame. It is an unhappy truth that racism is a way of life for the vast majority of white Americans, spoken and unspoken, acknowledged and denied, subtle and sometimes not so subtle. The disease of racism permeates and poisons a whole body politic. And I can see nothing more urgent than for America to work passionately and unrelentingly to get rid of the disease of racism. Dr. King says that everyone must share in this guilt as individuals, as institutions, and that there are myths that prevent progress, such as the myth that only time can solve racial justice. He says that people say to him to slow down, stop pushing things, be patient, and everything will work itself out. And he responds to this, there is an answer to that myth. It is that time is neutral. It can be used whether constructively or destructively. And I am sorry to say this morning that I am absolutely convinced that the forces of ill will in our nation, the extreme rightists of our nation, the people on the wrong side, have used time much more effectively than the forces of goodwill. And it may be well that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. So we must help time and realize that the time is always right to do right. And then Dr. King talks about another myth, which is the bootstrap philosophy, which is another one, a reason why I really like this speech, because this philosophy says that the Black man should lift himself out of poverty all by himself by his bootstraps. He talks about how when slaves were emancipated, they weren't given land to make that freedom meaningful. And he says it was something like keeping a person in prison for a number of years and suddenly discovering that that person is not guilty of the crime for which he was convicted. And you just go up to him and say, now you are free, but you don't give him any bus fare to get to town. You don't give him any money to get some clothes to put on his back or to get on his feet again in life. Every court of jurisprudence would rise up against this, and yet this is the very thing that our nation did to the Black man. It simply said, you're free, and it left him there, penniless, illiterate, not knowing what to do. And the irony of it all is that at the same time, the nation failed to do anything for the Black man, though an act of Congress was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. And Dr. King talks about these policies like land grant colleges and low interest rates and federal subsidies that benefited white people, and says that it is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. Dr. King closes the speech by saying that there will be difficult days ahead in the struggle for justice and peace, but he maintains hope. He says, I say to you that our goal is freedom, And I believe we are going to get there because however much she strays away from it, the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be as a people, our destiny is tied up in the destiny of America. He says, we're going to win our freedom because both the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands. And so, however dark it is, however deep the angry feelings are, and however violent explosions are, I can still sing, "We shall overcome." And then I'll leave you with this quote that comes next. That's my favorite quote, which is, "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Do you want to say anything more? You kind of gave a lot of context to that. Do you want to say anything more about why maybe that last quote sticks out to you?
Sure. So I would say, so I've known this quote for a long time, and I will say it gives me hope. It feels like you just want to hold on to it and just kind of ride with it into progress, into the future. And that somehow bigger than all of us is this sweep of like life and hopefully progress. But more in recent years, I have personally have to realize the context of it and the idea that it's not just happening on its own. It takes, in the context of this speech, it takes the effort, it takes action, it takes people not being silent. This isn't just this overarching like arc in humanity. It's like people are pushing it forward, and you have to realize that you're part of that. And if you want this to happen, you have to be part of it.
Nice. I hadn't connected the context of the time is always right to do what is right to his saying, you can't just ride time, that people have misused time, right? That the other side are the ones that are better at using time. And that goes just to what you're saying too. That's awesome. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to read what Barnabas used to be a part of our community, and now he is in Eastern Connecticut. But so welcome, Barnabas. I believe Dr. King was trying to get his people to think differently. He wanted us to fight for our right to be part of society. Even though we were not physically enslaved and on plantations, a lot of us were still enslaved mentally. Most of us were not educated, and many times we either created toxic ways of thinking and behaving as a community or became silent, which was a recent and famous behavior passed down from times of slavery. Dr. King used his notoriety to support the idea of change. We, as a people, could no longer just sit back, but need to take action.
Yes, thank you, Jose. As he said, my name is Barnabas. I am a recent Cabrini employee. I worked for Housing and Res Life there. I currently work in Connecticut at Eastern Connecticut State University as an assistant director in housing. When we talk about the ideas of silence and trying to even understand where our people were at that time, it really takes us we have to really think about where our people were mentally, emotionally. We were broken, and sometimes even now we still are. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. King is from his speech in Selma, when he said, "Our lives begin to end the day when we become silent about things that matter." There's so many things that so many times where certain big issues come up, and sometimes Black people feel like we can't say anything, or just minorities, period. We feel like, oh my God, like we have like a toxic mentality of we have to remain silent, or like somebody else has to fix these issues for us, or how do we advocate for ourselves? And as professionals, sometimes we struggle with that when it comes to our students on campus. How do I, as a professional, support students but still remain with a job? So it's and I think even though, and even, as we are becoming more educated, back then it was more so like we were creating um our own hierarchy of things, and we were just really um I guess ignorant to a lot of things because we were uneducated. But I think Dr. King tried his best to be like a person that we could aspire to be. He was trying to get his people engaged, trying to get us to do things. One of my other favorite quotes by him is, "If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, keep moving forward. Keep finding ways to do something. Like we have to. We can't just sit on our hands any longer and just accept what is being brought to us. We have to do something. Whether that means get allies, whatever we have to do, we have to make an effort to do something. And that's what I tell students even now, like the resources that are out there, like what have you done? You have to do something. And I think he was just trying to get us to, one, have a different way of thinking, and then two, just get us involved. Thank you.
Preach. Thank you, Barnabas. Thank you. Jose.
Yeah, that is my third favorite quote, Barnabas. I almost used it, and it's great that you were able to share that quote. It's one of my favorite ones that I'm constantly trying to remind myself to move forward, no matter what the situation is, no matter how beat down I might feel, I still need to move forward. I still need to move forward. So thank you. Our last reader of the day for this program is Lily Hathaway. She's going to be reading I've Been to the Mountaintop. Lily.
Thanks, Jose. Thanks, Ray and Jose, for inviting us to speak. This speech was quite long, so this is just an excerpt, but this is his final speech that he gave in support of striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, and it was given the day before he was assassinated. So he starts, "I'm delighted to see each of you here tonight. In spite of a storm warning, you reveal that you are determined to go on anyhow. Something is happening in Memphis. Something is happening in our world. Let us rise up tonight with a greater readiness. Let us stand with a greater determination. And let us move on in these powerful days. These days of challenge to make America what it ought to be. We have an opportunity to make America a better nation. And I want to thank God once more for allowing me to be here with you. You know, several years ago, I was in New York City autographing the first book that I had written. And while sitting there autographing books, a demented Black woman came up. The only question I heard from her was, 'Are you Martin Luther King?' And I was looking down writing and I said, 'Yes.' And the next minute, I felt something beating on my chest. Before I knew it, I had been stabbed by this demented woman. I was rushed to Harlem Hospital. It was a dark Saturday afternoon, and that blade had gone through, and the x-rays revealed that the tip of the blade was on the edge of my aorta, the main artery. And once that's punctured, you drown in your own blood, and that's the end of you. It came out in the New York Times the next morning that if I had sneezed, I would have died. Well, about 4 days later, they allowed me, after the operation, after my chest had been opened and the blade had been taken out, to move around in the wheelchair in the hospital. They allowed me to read some of the mail that came in, and from all over the states and the world, kind letters came in. I read a few, but one of them I will never forget. I had received one from the president and vice president. I've forgotten what those telegrams said. I've received a visit and a letter from the governor of New York, but I've forgotten what the letter said. But there was another letter that came from a little girl, a young girl who was a student at White Plains High School. And I looked at that letter and I'll never forget it. It simply said, "Dear Dr. King, I am a ninth grade student at the White Plains High School," she said. "And while it should not matter, I would like to mention that I'm a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering, and I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. And I'm simply writing you to say that I'm so happy that you didn't sneeze. And I want to say tonight, and I want to say that I am happy that I didn't sneeze, because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1960 when students all over the South started sitting in at lunch counters. And I knew that as they were sitting in, they were really standing up for the best in the American dream and taking the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around in 1962 when Negroes in Albany, Georgia decided to straighten up their backs. And whenever men and women straighten up their backs, they're going somewhere, because a man can't ride your back unless it's bent. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been here in 1963 when the Black people of Birmingham, Alabama aroused the conscience of this nation and brought into being the Civil Rights Bill. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have had a chance later that year in August to try to tell America about a dream I had had. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been down in Selma, Alabama, been in Memphis to see the community rally those brothers and sisters who are suffering. I'm so happy that I didn't sneeze. And they're telling me now, it doesn't matter now. It really doesn't matter what happens now. I left Atlanta this morning, and as we got started on the plane, there were 6 of us, the pilot said over the public address system. "We are sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King on the plane, and to be sure all the bags were checked, and to be sure nothing would be wrong with the plane, we had to check everything out carefully, and we've had the plane protected and guarded all night." And then when I got to Memphis, and some began to say the threats or talk about the threats that were out there, what would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers? Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind, like anybody. I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight, and I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. So just to kind of put why I chose it, obviously he seems to be foreshadowing his own assassination, but I think the last year of his life, like you can see from Todd's speech and even parts of Lisa's, the last year he really was constantly foreshadowing what we now know is to come. So any of those speeches could have been his last, where he really is talking about potentially the end of his life, and I think his legacy. So I think that resonates because there's a lot of anxiety about violence against our political leaders, and so that's kind of the first thing that resonates with me about this speech. He's talking about his own anxiety of violence against him, but the other piece that really resonates with me is just the fact that he's kind of referencing a little bit of allyship, right? Where he kind of disregards the letters from the president, the vice president, the governor, and he really could care less about what they said to him. These big important people in our world, and he remembers this short letter from a little white girl in the middle of nowhere, USA, and how she just simply wrote a letter saying I'm here with you, and I want you to be okay. And as a white person, I just this is kind of, it's really important to me, because if you do kind of nothing else, just extending your hand to someone in these times to say, like, I understand you, or just listening, is super important. Like, this little girl was not saying anything grand. She wasn't trying to make any point other than, like, I'm here. I'm here. I hear you. I see you. And I think that that is really so important right now, because, like we've talked about before, I think Brian was touching on it, but, like, silence is really complicit. And so, even just if you don't know what else to do, at least reaching out to someone to say, like, I'm here for you, whatever you need to support your cause, to do. So thanks, Jose. Saw your chat.
Thank you, Lily. Truly, that was a wonderful way to end the speeches. Truly, yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any
like,
other comments of what?
Sorry, I was
to the
just gonna say,
mountaintops?
like, I know that that's, like, it's his last speech, so it's so, like, it's so striking, the foreshadowing that he's giving, right? Like, but yet, when we look at Todd's speech, or any of the others, like, he's constantly foreshadowing, the end for him, because he just, I can't imagine the level of anxiety he has every single day, because if this speech didn't exist, and, like, I keep bringing up Todd's because, like, he referenced it specifically in his speech, but that could have very well been his last one too, and it would have been that foreshadowing. So it's like, I can't imagine the anxiety he felt during this period where he just knew, like, any second were going to be his last words to the masses. So it definitely is striking.
Can I just add to Lily? Well, thank you so much for sharing that. That was definitely powerful. I know I got a little teary eyed because it's just so sad to see someone of such a great stature go through that and share these amazing words, because I do feel like words are powerful. But also, I just feel like some people, like Dr. King, are meant to be here for a short time for that impact. And unfortunately, I feel like he knew his purpose was being fulfilled, and it's so sad. But thank you for being an ally. We do need people, especially allies, but also I just want to say that for me at least, that's how I feel as a person of color, because I really don't, that anxiety is, like, real for me. And I never know, something's going to happen to me or my loved ones, or other people around the world that look like me, and that's the constant, like, fear and anxiety. And you try to be as strong as you can, and not to go deep into religion or spirituality. I don't know, people have different beliefs, but holding on to that hope that it'll get better, or holding on to that hope that if you say something, everything's going to be all right. Because what was said earlier, I can't remember who said it, like, just having that courage to say something without there being repercussions is very scary. But it needs to be said. So it's like that constant dilemma, like, do I say something and, like, lose my job, lose my life, or do I just be complacent? And it's like that tug of war every day, just that internal war. So I just think that it's more relevant now than it was when he said it. And I'm just grateful that we had the opportunity to experience him. Not right now, because we weren't born in the 60s, but I mean, some of us probably were. But just having that legacy that he had, the fact that we can just speak about that now speaks volumes. So I feel like he fulfilled this purpose. So thank you for reading that. Thank you for being an ally. We need people. We're not meant to be alone. We're here to do it together, and the only way we're going to do that is together. So thank you so much.
I just want to read what Celia said. He was a great prominent of love as a powerful force for social change. From loving your enemies. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Thank you, Celia. So we're going to transition to our last portion, which is going to be led by Ray Ward, and really having us think about moving ourselves, working towards bending that curve, right? As Lisa said, and not being that silent anymore, and being a lot more vocal and towards being an activist and an advocate. So, Ray?
Yeah, and I'll keep it quick because I feel like, we went to school today. I know school doesn't start for another couple weeks, but, I guess next week, but thank you to everybody for sharing your hearts. I mean, I think that's really what we had today. People really opening up, from the readers to people responding, people putting things in chat. Thank you. I hope this is definitely a day on, I'm feeling like. And I'm just here to add a couple other ideas about what you might do next. We talked a little bit about some of the opportunities people are around. But at Cabrini, it's been a while since we did a day of service, and I know people are saying maybe that is something that we should be doing for MLK Day, especially after COVID. Really get people together, have that be something we do. But at the very least, I would really encourage you to look into advocacy. How can we take inspiration from Dr. King to make lasting change? Work together, like Naya had said, that this is something that we work together on. And I know people already have some of their causes, and I'm probably preaching to the choir right now, but I just wanted to, the simplest step is to make sure you get people in your phones. Find out who your elected officials are, find out how the elections turned out. Some of these have changed, some of them are the same. But if you go to www.usa.gov/elected-officials, and I can put that URL in the chat too. Look them up. You can get there. You'll get to this page, and you can see, who the president is now, and you're going to see who it is in just a couple days. New senators, representatives, all the way down to your local officials as well. Please get their numbers in your phone. Give them a call. Leave a message. Leave messages until they need to get a longer answering machine, because that's what it's going to take. If you are living at Cabrini, these are your federal elected officials aside from the president. Get their numbers in your phone. If you give them a call, try to connect with a staffer. If you can get an email address of a staffer, that's an even better way to set up a meeting. Get the thing that you care about in front of your representative or your senator. If you've got questions about how to do this, there's people on this very call that are really good at this. Tap Brian Urie's brain if you've ever got something that you really want to, take to the political mat. Come by the Wolfington Center, let us know that you care about something. We can connect you with people that are organizing around some of these things.